Okay, it's 10:01. We should start. So, hello and welcome to ADAPTOVATE webinar, Agile in Business Speeding Up Change Delivery. And today we'll talk about our experiences with Agile transformations beyond IT. So a little bit about ourselves. Our company, ADAPTOVATE, is a global Agile consulting company founded in 2017 by 3 ex-BCG executives. And currently, we have a team of around 60 specialists in 6 offices around the world, in Australia, Singapore, Los Angeles, Toronto, and of course, our European office located in Warsaw. We specialize in Agile ways of working and making sustainable change in organizations. So our services focus on 3 areas, which you can see on the slide here. We support organizational transformations with business coaching. We execute end-to-end Agile at scale journeys, and we support organizations with Agile business design. And here you can see some examples of clients we have done work with globally. And with a few of them, we have also worked in Europe. So we work with large corporates, with small organizations and startups, and with GOs and NGOs. So a few words about us. This is our team who's working mostly in Europe. So apart from me, you will be hearing from Maja and Chris during today's webinar. And the topic for today is Agile in Business Speeding Up Change Delivery, and we will focus on practical applications of Agile outside of IT, based on our own experiences and acting as a preferred BCG global partner for Agile transformation. We will aim to answer the following questions today. So how to start the journey towards new ways of working and how to create a lasting change. And then we'll talk about Agile MVP concept, how to use it to bring things to market faster, and how to break down work and prioritize to build Agile MVPs. So before we start, a few house rules. Please stay on mute. The session will be recorded, and we encourage your participation in the questions and answers section. And should questions arise in the course of this presentation, please type them in the chat window. And should you have additional questions or comments, do not hesitate to contact us after the webinar. We aim to finish the session in 1 hour, 15 minutes max. We'll try to do it in 1 hour. And we wouldn't be Agile practitioners if we didn't invite feedback and we didn't inspect and adapt. So please dedicate a few minutes to fill in the feedback form after the webinar and leave your feedback so we can improve. So let's start then. We have prepared a couple of points for the session today. We will start with the point, what is Agile and why Agile in business? So it all started with many failed waterfall projects, where we typically spend months documenting the requirements, designing and developing before we show the final result to customers. And once we do that, we typically delay it and over budget. And the result is often not that exciting. So what changes in Agile is we work in short sprints and we collect feedback after each sprint so that we can concentrate on what the customers really want. And Agile is often used to describe many frameworks and methodologies. However, it is much more than that. Agile is a change in culture and values. And the most seminal moment in modern history of Agile is probably the publishing of the Manifesto for Agile Software Development by a group of developers back in 2001. And let's look at the 4 key directions outlined in that manifesto. So the author said, we value customer collaboration over contract negotiation, working output over comprehensive documentation, responding to change over following a plan, and we value individuals and interactions over processes and tools. Now, the authors clearly stated that while there is value in the items at the bottom of our slide, we value the items above much more. Because still today, these values should guide every Agile transformation. Now, we have developed our own approach to Agile transformations. And the key elements of that approach, we call sometimes them non-negotiables, are these 5 that are displayed on the slide. So the first element, the MVP, which is the minimum viable product. That's the first version of the product released to customers to get feedback as soon as possible. We will spend some more time discussing the MVP later today. The second element, the new roles. Agile splits the traditional role of the manager into different roles. In particular, the person responsible for what should be done, that's the product owner. Persons responsible for how that work should be done, that's chapter leads, and the person who makes sure that the team works effectively. So that's the Scrum Master or Agile coach. And these roles come together to form a system of checks and balances, which positively affects the team. Another element, user stories. So this is the format used by the teams to describe their work, which briefly tells who we're doing the work for, what exactly we're doing, and why we're doing this. The ceremonies and artifacts, which is basically how we describe team sessions and boards used to plan and track the progress of work of the team, and planning. So here it's worth noting that against the widespread notion, Agile teams actually do a lot of planning. So they never really create a plan in the traditional sense. Agile teams plan in several time horizons, and the longer the horizon, the less detailed the plan. That's the general rule. In practice, Agile teams rarely have a detailed plan of work longer than 1 or 2 months ahead. But Agile is not a goal in itself. Agile ways of working not only create a more engaging and satisfying work environment, but also improve productivity and time to market. So Agile organizations deliver change faster by a factor of 2 to 3 compared with traditional waterfall organizations. Now, is it worth bringing Agile to business? Absolutely, yes. We strongly recommend this. We have seen this work many times over, and Agile, in our opinion, in business is a natural next step. So new ways of working originated in IT, as we discussed. After all, the authors of the manifesto were software developers, and the community of developers quickly caught on. And for this reason, most organizations start with pockets of Agile in IT, teams or groups of teams who start using new ways of working. And at this point, the benefits are visible, but the tensions between IT and business still exist. So the natural next step is to invite parts of the business that work closely with IT to collaborate on the same teams. Now, typically parts of business involving development of products and processes jump on board here. Now, many organizations stop at this point, leaving out the rest of the business, the marketing, sales, and operations, and the support areas, legal, risk, compliance, and HR, leaving them out of the transformations. And the tensions between Agile and non-Agile parts of the organization are still there. And as long as they exist, the full benefits will not be attained. So bringing new ways of working to these remaining business and support areas is a step worth taking. And the fact that these areas don't develop products or run projects is not an excuse to leave them out of the transformation. And with some adjustments to the methods, to tools, to collaboration models, all units start to speak the same customer language, and an Agile, a truly Agile organization can emerge. Now, maybe enough of the theory. Let's move to some practical things, and we'll talk about how to ensure a lasting change in ways of working. And Maja will talk us through that.
Thank you, Slawek. Okay, so let's talk about how to start the journey of scaling Agile across the organization. Agile is typically quite easy to understand, but the effective application is not that easy. It does require adjustment to the specifics of the organization. So there are usually 2 ways to deliver Agile transformation. And each of those ways requires commitment of the leadership to succeed. The first way is to prepare the transformation top-down in a big bang format. It takes usually months, sometimes even years to prepare, and requires a lot of determination of the leadership to shift the organization to new ways of working on actually a specific day. It is possible and it is doable. However, as you can guess, it is relatively risky. So in our experience, easier way to start Agile transformation is bottom-up. The first step of this process is readiness assessment. And after it's conducted, we launch 1 or more pilot teams, creating so-called pockets of Agile or lighthouse projects. What does that give us? First of all, we can test the new approach and adjust the specifics to the needs of the organization before scaling it up. So we're reducing risk. The second one is that the success of the initial teams helps to build interest internally and buy-in. Normally people want to jump on board when they see success. So After we do those steps, after the initial approach is tested, it's refined, and the first agile teams demonstrate success and create some interest, we usually reach a tipping point. And the tipping point is the point where leaders actually have to make a decision whether agile is scaled further or not. If so, usually the board agrees on the changes of the operating model. And at this point, there is usually already a strong need for Agile Center of Excellence for training, coaching, and knowledge share to support the journey. As you can see here on the slide, the last stage is the transition to the new operating model. And organizations that have it can really introduce innovations and adapt to market changes much faster. Why? Because development and support functions collaborate effectively and the entire company is aligned, as simple as that. So having said that, to deliver a full transformation successfully, changes are required in many different areas. So we developed our own approach to agile transformations. May I ask for the next slide? Thank you. So as you can see on this slide, we have created our own model. It consists of 7 areas, and we specifically look at those areas to design optimal agile model and roadmaps, even for large and complex transformations. We will not go into details here, but it is important to remember and acknowledge that there is a broader perspective on how the organization works when we design the change to make it successful. So moving on from the more global look, let's look at the team, at the transformation on the team level. What is really required to reach team maturity, right? So usually it takes 4 steps. The first step, as you see here, is basic roles and routines. So at this moment, at this level, we usually provide basic training in Agile. We establish the cadence of ceremonies. We check and set up the proper support tools for the teams. This is the first basic step. The second step, it's already a phase of improvement. We take a look again at the team objectives and we check if they are really relevant. We refine the backlog and improve it. We also look at how the ceremonies are run and the tools are used, and we improve in the areas where it's necessary. The third stage is the phase of coordination between the teams. Usually at this level, we refine the collaboration models. Sometimes we need to introduce new tools, such as periodic business review for more transparency. And also we help leaders develop behaviors that will successfully support the culture of change. The last step, embedding continuous improvement, is the step where we take a look at self-correcting mechanisms. So first of all, are the retrospectives effective? Does team have proper pulse checks? Do we collect feedback properly? Is the knowledge exchange? If this step is done right, then we can ensure the continuous improvement and the lasting change at the end. How long does this process take? Usually it takes around 3 months. The shorter periods allow to establish the basic mechanics and tools, but usually it is not enough time to change the behavior of people, right? So this is the team perspective and the team maturity. And after we set up the tools, after we set up the cadence of teams and new ways of working, it is really important to look at 3 key aspects of any kind of change. First is the work environment, second is mindset, and the third is organizational culture. And now we would like to give you an example for each of those areas, so you can see what kind of action is required for people that support the agile change. First point, work environment. How does work environment impact agile change? I'll give you an example of the German company that we worked with that was established to support German healthcare and the Ministry of Health. As you can guess, the corporate culture was quite traditional, command and control style with a bureaucratic mindset. And when you went into the office, the atmosphere was self-evident. You could see long corridors, little offices, and people sitting separately. The company would probably operate like that for quite a long time, But they got a very ambitious task, and this was to provide an infrastructure and specifications for a huge digital transformation in healthcare. And they needed to do it not in 3 or 4 year cycles like they usually worked, but actually during 1 or 2 years max. So the new CEO took the challenge. And the first step that was taken was to break actually the silos and the bureaucratic mindset and culture. And this was done by creating new functional, cross-functional teams, and they were co-located in the same rooms. And of course, that was a big challenge that had to be overcome, not just paperwork and logistics, but sometimes just simply rebuilding the offices. And there was also a human factor, as there always is. People simply did not want to sit together because some of them simply didn't like each other. So, but the change was implemented, put in place after much work from the leadership. And what we observed after 2 weeks of co-located work is that the team already, after one sprint, started to perform together smoothly, especially the smaller teams that were 6 to 7 people. And also, interestingly, they really started to enjoy their company. The developers and testers that normally didn't collaborate, they started to work together instead of playing the usual blame game. And on the top of that, there was a lot of informal conversation that took place, and people started bringing new ideas, how to create strategy long-term that inspired the entire organization. So the first lesson that we learned here was that sitting together and office environment is really important. When you collocate the teams, it really helps them get along better and focus on the common goal. And this is extremely important, especially for the older generations. Sometimes you might think that Agile is a new trend for young people, but the generation that grew up without smartphones and Slacks and WhatsApp and SharePoints and even email really, really appreciate the basic human interactions and working together that Agile setup provides. So work environment is really, really important. The second element is the mindset. And in Agile, it is very important. And one of the important elements of mindset is giving the teams more responsibility and empowering them to take decisions themselves. Agile organizations are typically flatter. Agile teams have more autonomy in their work, and it does require the change of mindset, both from leaders and the teams. So to give you an example, some leaders will be relieved and they will say, well, okay, now that we are Agile, let the team self-organize. And on the other hand, the teams are not prepared to take decisions. It's something new to them. They don't know the limits of their autonomy, so they wait, and the leaders wait. So if you are in the supporting role as an Agile coach, transformation leader, it is very important to facilitate the discussion, to give feedback, openly discuss blockers, as some assumptions to make sure everybody's on the right track, they understand each other's expectations, and they reach the same goals. There's also another group of leaders that really struggle to give up control. And we had one interesting example in one of the cases in Asia, when the team was given quite a lot of autonomy after the Agile transformation, and they became really very motivated and engaged. But after a couple of months, the new leader arrived with a more traditional, typical for that country, command and control style of management. And the team pushed back really hard, and few people even left. And what we heard from the team, the feedback was really interesting. From their perspective, they said that in Asian culture, in their country, the command and control style was quite common. And for them, it was even convenient, and they were always adapted to it. But once they changed the ways of working, they didn't know how to come back to the old ways. So this is a very important point as well, that once you start the journey of changing people's mindset, it's hard to come back to the old ways. And then the third point, organizational culture. Another example of the company we worked with, when we started, the level of trust between people, employees, managers was very, very low. So there was no sharing of information or documents. The access to documents was restricted on need-to-know basis, which obviously hindered communication to the point that even on the same project, people didn't know what they were doing. For example, testers and developers worked on separate platforms, and they didn't see the progress on the same products. So of course, a part of working on improving the tools, we started to work with them in a 2-week cadence and introduce the sprints. And after the end of the sprints, we run showcases when the teams discuss with the stakeholders and leaders the results of their work and receive feedback. And this session was organized, it was attended by everyone. And even though it was just the first meeting and it was quite technical, the discussion from our point of view, it was really a revolutionary step from the company. And one of the managers came back to us afterwards with the feedback that this was actually the first time in the history of her working in that company when she witnessed such an open discussion between managers and the project teams. So sometimes even little steps can provide a big change. So to sum up the main points from this part, what needs to happen to create a lasting change? It's really good to start slow, but don't stop halfway. It's important to look broadly at how organization works to eliminate blockers where they are. The Agile teams need support to reach maturity, and they need some time, typically around 3 months. And it is really important not just to put in place processes and tools, but focus on culture, mindset, and work environment, which will be the deal breaker at the end. So thank you very much. And now we would like to move on to MVP. Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Maja, very much. Yeah, in this section, we'll get down to some practical elements. So we'll talk about the MVP. We'll try to answer questions of what is it, how to prepare it. And at the end of the day, I think that the thing that interests everybody the most is how to effectively use it in our business. So let's go on. Innovative teams effectively use an Agile MVP concept, but in order to create an effective MVP, the teams need to effectively, number one, break down the work that they are trying to tackle, and on the next side, try to rigorously prioritize that work. So let's look at an example of how it's done. So the MVP stands for minimum viable product, and it is the first version of the product released to customers that has enough functionalities and value derived, value given to the client that we can receive early feedback. Of course, each MVP has its own business metrics, but the main purpose of the MVP is not per se to generate business for the organization, but it is there to collect the customer feedback. So we have that data, that information to know how to develop the product, which way to go, and how to satisfy the needs of the client at the end of the day, because that's what we're aiming for. And we sometimes hear from our customers that Agile is about releasing half-baked products that have a lot of bugs. Well, that's not really how an Agile MVP works, and that's not what it's about. And if that occurs, because that does happen sometimes, then it's usually the result of a lack of understanding of Agile and the MVP concept, or some external or internal factors that basically inhibit the process itself, causing some challenges and causing some inefficiencies. And to introduce the idea of an Agile MVP, let's look at an example of a wedding cake. That's what you have presented on this slide. So let's imagine that we run a bakery, and our customers, that's a young couple that's planning their wedding, would like to order a cake. And at the moment when they approach us, the customer expects the cake to have broadly flowery decorations and raspberry cream. And to make sure that we prepare the right product at the end for the client to be satisfied, we offer them a muffin with raspberry cream and some decorations. That's what you see on the left side. And after the tasting, the customer decides to go with it or not. So we prepared the first version of the cake and learned that the customer would like more layers, for example, or would like real flowers instead of a sugar ones that you see on the left. And that would be the decoration. So the product grows with the appetite of the customer, and the end product that you see on the right meets the expectations of the user, because on each step, on each iteration, we got that feedback and we could adapt to it. But going a bit off of the cake example, let's look at a business example from one of our recent clients, one of our recent engagements. So one of the leading travel and hospitality players created a strategic initiative, and they decided to develop a stopover product. But they did not want to use the traditional method. They wanted to use the Agile MVP approach to speed up the development. And if you're not familiar with what a stopover is, I personally was not, because I don't travel that much for holidays. The stopover is when a traveler stops for a day or 2 days at a given city that's between their country or their location of origin and destination. For example, someone traveling from Chicago to Tokyo may want to stop over in, for example, Dubai for 1 and 2 days to visit the city, discover a new culture, go on excursions. Dune buggies in the desert is phenomenal in the Middle East. So the team, instead of preparing a wide choice of options for the customer, decided on an MVP, which consisted of a very simple stopover booking flow. There was only one default hotel and a very limited choice of add-ons, like only one excursion that was available. And the product was to be offered only on inbound flights for a very select group of target customers. Like I gave you the example, only for customers traveling, for example, from Chicago. And the idea was to quickly release that product to the market so we could test, first of all, the demand. Is this a viable business offering for the clients? The functionality, do we have to develop more hotels, new excursions? Where should we go? The third side is technical feasibility. This was not a standard product, and there were some challenges of how to do it in an effective way, how the customers should book the flights, how they should book the excursions, and how to do it from a customer satisfaction, UX, and technical point of view. And products like this normally took roughly half a year to maybe 6, 7, 8 months to develop in the traditional way that the client utilized prior to trying the MVP method. But the limited scope and the functionalities that we had in the MVP allowed them to put the product on the market, of course, to this limited group of customers within 6 weeks. And immediately on the 6 weeks and 1 day, we received the first feedback from the clients on the booking flow, on the excursion. We could try to gauge the demand in the next several weeks to really get some meaningful insights onto the product. But that's one example. You may start to think how to basically limit the scope of the Agile MVP and break down the work. That's shown on the next slide. Agile organizations usually cascade strategic targets down the organization by breaking them down into work elements that we call themes, epics, and user stories. And each subsequent level means a smaller scope of work and a more detailed description of the outcomes that are needed. A user story that is too large and complex to be completed within one sprint is usually an epic. And teams break down these epics into several user stories so they can tackle these work elements. And user stories are items of work that can be completed by one team within one sprint. But more advanced teams that have a good level of cooperation or have a very good rhythm of work can sometimes execute a user story within 2 to 3 days. Well, now you may be asking yourself a question, what's a user story? Well, a user story is a method of writing down the format of work that we're conducting. And it's quite simple. It entails answering 3 basic questions. Who are we doing the work for? What exactly are we doing? And why are we doing the work? And this format helps in the discussions of how to break down the work amongst the team, but it also allows for alignment. If somebody sees a work element with these 3 answers, who are we doing it for? Why are we doing it? And why are we doing it? Can easily see what the work element consists of. It's usually who, what, and why. And an important point to remember is that user stories should describe outcomes. Those are the outcomes required for a version of the product. They do not describe specific tasks that need to be executed. But going a step further, and remember when I told you to talk about the MVP, we talk about how to break down work. Now I want to dive deeper into how to prioritize the work that we're conducting. So, Slav, can I ask you for the next slide? Thank you very much. So we will talk about two simple tools that we utilize on a daily basis when working with teams, specifically with larger teams when there may be a bit more chaos, maybe some opinions that are not aligned. We utilize the value matrix or the user story mapping. And at this moment, Slav will dive deeper into the value matrix.
Yes, thank you. So we have more of these tools. We selected these two because they seem to be very popular and very, very effective. And we're sometimes amazed by how rarely they are used in traditional waterfall organizations. But let's talk about the value matrix. So it's a simple and effective tool to discuss and decide on priorities as a team. And you can see the template of the matrix on the slide. You can see the business value on the vertical axis and the feasibility on the horizontal axis. And this is a template that the session facilitator prepares before the team session using either a wall, a whiteboard, or maybe simply projecting it on the wall and then working from there. And with remote teams, we typically use collaboration tools such as Miro or Mural, which we absolutely strongly recommend. Now, the facilitator prepares also physical or virtual cards with elements to be prioritized. And the team discusses the business value and feasibility of each element and decides by placing the card in the proper field of the matrix. Now, it helps to use some techniques from the planning poker. So there's people with different opinions than the rest of the group explain their view, and then another round of team voting takes place. And sometimes we use techniques that help decrease the emotional involvement of some team members, especially people who are already engaged in an initiative or in a work item that is being discussed. And these people can only answer questions from other team members, but cannot actively sell their initiatives. And that helps in objective decision making. Now, after all the cards have been placed on the matrix, we prioritize according to the numbers in the fields, and we can clearly see the quick wins, that's field number 1, and valuable items that require more effort to deliver, as well as the items that are very low in priority, which will probably not be touching anytime soon. So the priorities help define the scope of MVP, and we can even draw a line on the matrix to clearly mark the scope of the MVP. And it's important to know that, as with most Agile team sessions, the discussion is as valuable as the result. During the discussion, the team adopts new perspectives and discovers new solutions and creates new ideas. So let's look at a practical example of a value matrix from one of our cases. And there we go. This is an example of a value matrix that we used for a session with around 10 managers. And the session took around 45 minutes to complete. And in that time, we managed to effectively discuss and prioritize 11 initiatives. Now look at the vertical and horizontal axis, the business value and the feasibility and the layout of the additional elements. And in this particular case, we had an additional complication. The project sponsor asked us to discuss additional sub-criteria. So for business value, we discussed how each initiative influenced existing customer engagement and new customer acquisition. And for feasibility, we discussed both cost and time to implement. So in this case, the prioritization process had 2 stages. First, we discussed the sub-criteria using the 2x2 matrix on the right-hand side, and then we used the result to place the card on the proper row or column of the main matrix. What happens when 2 or more elements land in the same field of the value matrix? What do we do then? Well, we typically use 4 criteria for prioritization: the business value, the feasibility, but also the risks and the learnings. So the main criteria are business value and feasibility, and the risks and learnings are used as tiebreakers when items score on the main criteria. And some may have doubts as to the accuracy of such team prioritization. We have heard that it's not detailed or not complex enough. Well, we assure you that while it's not perfect, it's more than enough for the team to start work on the top priority items. And after all, the most important thing is to quickly prepare the first version, release it to customers, and they will decide whether the development should continue or not. But let's move on to another tool that we would like to discuss today, the user story mapping. Chris.
Yeah, thank you very much, Slav, for that. Yeah, so as Slav mentioned, the next tool that we use a lot is called user story mapping, and it allows for visualization of a customer journey, but it also allows for prioritizing the elements of the customer journey. But at the end of the day, the thing that we really strive for, which is setting the scope of the MVP. And we really like the user story mapping tool because it tells a story, and people are really accustomed to the story format. It has actors, it has a starting point, it has a destination, well, and things happen along that journey. We start with creating a backbone. So we agree on who is the customer and what are the steps of the customer journey. And those are the yellow post-its you see on the slide. At this stage, when we have the backbone ready, we focus on creating the entire journey without getting into too much detail about the steps that occurred. Once we have this, once we have the backbone, we deep dive into each of the steps of the journey. Those are each of the steps that are represented here with the yellow post-its, and put the desired outcomes in the format of user stories under each of them, each of these steps. That adds detail and context. After that, we proceed to discuss the priorities within each of the steps. The team raises the top priority cards to the top of the map. And those user stories here are represented as yellow post-its, and the prioritization is, as you can look at the arrow, the closer it is to the yellow backbone, the higher the priority is of that detailed step. And when we have this this map drawn out, we can start to draw a line that is presented here in blue, and it's called an increment, that will set the scope of the MVP. But as you can see in this picture, there are other post-its on the story mapping, on the story map, that are below the line. These are usually utilized as an excursion or as an expansion of the MVP. So now I would like to give the stage to Slav, so we can present to you an example of a user story map, of the outcome of the user story mapping exercise from one of our engagements.
Yeah, yes, thank you. So what you can see on the slide is a map that we use for stopover product that Chris already mentioned today. Look at the way the team structured the map. So the backbone is formed with themes relating to stages of customer journey, and the epics are used to structure the outcomes. And we structure the outcomes in relation to two groups of customers. So the independent travelers and the travel agents. User stories, that's the green post-it notes you can see, are clearly aligned to that epics. Top priority elements, top priority green cards that form the MVP were marked with pink stickers. This entire exercise lasted about 2 hours and allowed to effectively visualize structure and plan of work. So this map was a live artifact. It's important to say that it didn't just disappear after that session. It became part of the Agile team room, and it helped in many conversations with stakeholders for weeks and weeks to come. So that's it about the basic tools. Let's maybe move on to some practical examples of how Agile MVPs are used in business to bring things to market faster. And let's start with an example of launching a new channel. That's a WhatsApp channel. And here the organization wanted to improve the speed and quality of customer interactions and reduce call center traffic. That was the goal. So together with the team, we defined the scope of the MVP using the techniques described today, and we limited the scope to selected customer segments that were the loyalty program tiers, the top tiers of the loyalty program, and 5 selected geographic markets. And also the scope was limited to customer account servicing only and English language only. So no sales and support for other languages at this stage. So the limited scope allowed to deliver the solution in 10 weeks. So the MVP version allowed to collect customer feedback, and the feedback was good. The feedback was very good, but the customers didn't really like one point in the process where it was relating to data processing agreements. So that was a terrible. They were not really happy about that point, but we managed to decrease call center traffic. So the next steps, clearly discussed with the team and agreed on, was to implement some process improvements and introduce additional scenarios, as well as expand into new geographies. And that really happened fast. So let's look at another example. Yes, launch of a new tool in social media. Chris.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Slav. So next example is from a FMCG company that's headquartered in Switzerland. And as part of their global digital transformation initiative, one of the key aspects of it was to launch a social media here in an analytics tool. And the project, basically the scope was created out of two major steps, which was the development and the implementation of the tool. And in the first phase that lasted a year, the client underwent the implementation and development with their software provider. And the way they approached it was, as we call it, in a traditional waterfall fashion. So first, the development consisted of a very rigorous and time-consuming functionality gathering undertaking, which lasted for roughly 4 to 5 months. Then we had the coding of this solution, and then we had the implementation to all of the 30 markets that they wanted to implement it. Well, the challenges that they faced here were that all the developments, all the functionalities were gathered from the 30 countries that they wanted to implement it at. So they basically sent out a list of what sort of functionalities the tool has, and each of the markets ticked which functionality they want to have. And they were creating a massive laundry list that then the software provider coded for 4 months, and they had a massive tool that was extremely challenging to use, extremely challenging to implement, and at the end of the day, to train the 30 markets, the teams on all the 30 markets. And that's what basically happened throughout the year. The tool was too complex, the implementation was too burdensome to be managed centrally, and well, that initiative failed. So the next approach they tried to utilize was utilizing the Agile MVP. Instead of creating a massive tool, they engaged our team to select 4 major, most important functionalities that bring most value to each of these markets. And that's what we created. It's the backbone, the MVP, that afterwards we tested and implemented on select 4 markets in a 4 to 5 week sprint, teaching and coaching the teams and gathering their feedback. After the 4 or 5 weeks that we were on the market, the client could immediately use the tool, see which functionalities are not ideal and where they want to develop it. And with that feedback, we came back and adjusted it and rolled out to the next 4 to 5 markets. Well, after a year, we were successful. We managed to roll out the solution in the 30 markets. It wasn't an amazingly large solution due to the fact that we only honed in on the aspects that were most critical and brought the most value. Thank you. Back to you, Slav.
Yes, thank you. So the MVP can be applied practically to every business project, and we have successfully used it in many cases. In other cases, like optimization of physical distribution network, where MVP was limited to geographical area, selected physical points, functions, and roles. Design of a new sales process, where the MVP scope was limited to one type of product and customer segment. The selected functional elements and process steps, and that were automated, while the rest of the process was serviced manually. And that was fine. That was okay at that point with limited volumes. Or using AI for personalization of offer. That was a very interesting case where we defined MVP on a selected customer journey with selected contact points, and we worked to personalize the communication content and the commercial terms for each customer. So we have successfully used Agile concepts in such non-obvious areas, like, for example, preparation of documents, policies, and regulations. And in this case, within Sprint, we work on form of the document, so the structure, the level of detail, the references, etc., and the content of the document. So we break down the content into topic areas or categories of changes and prioritize them with the tools that we discussed today to define document versions. The first of that versions is, of course, the MVP. So that's it for the examples. We have reached the questions and answers section, and we will do our best to answer all the questions that have been raised so far. And if you have any other questions, please use the chat window or Q&A window to submit the questions. We do have a few questions from Amit. Amit, please let us know if you're satisfied with the answer, or you would like us to elaborate on this one. But I would also like to come back to the first question posted about aligning the team maturity model that Maja was talking about with the forming, storming, norming, performing, the popular model of team maturity. And I answered that these models can run in parallel, but are rather complementary. They're not interchangeable, of course. And our model is strictly focused on agile maturity of teams. So building agile maturity, agile competences, agile mindset, and so on. So we typically start with this first element, which is creating the right routines, the basic routines. So it makes no sense to refine the routines and talk about the structure of the sessions in detail when people are not really getting up and having their daily stand-ups, or not really meeting for the retro sessions and so on. So we have to dedicate some time to create those basic instincts, to the point that when we see when people are not really asking each other, oh, let's have a session, one of the team members is actually standing up from the desk and calling in, and the other just follow, like without a word. That means that they're ready to move to the next step. And then the next step is actually improving that collaboration, refining those behaviors. And after we do that, we focus on collaboration of that team with other sections of the organization. That's level 3. And level 4 is sometimes call it, the first 3 steps we call the building blocks. Step 4 is like the cement that puts those building blocks together and makes this whole building stable and lasting. So when the step 4 is completed, the teams are able to recognize and acknowledge their own problems and deal with them independently. So we can take our hands off and say, okay, you will be able to continuously improve and bring this further without any intervention from outside. So in that sense, it's a slightly different approach, but the approach that you mentioned, we subscribe to this, of course, and we try to sometimes speed this up by discussing the team norms up front. Before the teams actually decide on their own norms, we organize a team session, discuss this, and write it down and create a social contract. Agree that the teams will work in a certain way.
Thanks, Slav. I want to, if you don't mind, I would want to pick up the question about the MVP, and I see that the second part about the 80% of the content, that's, on point. I absolutely agree. So I want to pick up the first part, which is, I just read it out loud. I have learned that when we say MVP, business comes up with the most important work and wants that as MVP. Well, I could approach this. I think the best way to approach this is trying to come up with business comes up with the most important work, right? Then we start with I think that's where you start with a bit of a problem, because how do you define what's the most important work? So if this is based on some goals that, you have different departments that may have different goals, and everyone fights for having their own work being executed, that's not really how I would consider to be the most important goal. And the real value derived from, doing projects in the MVP way is that if you have some level of uncertainty, for example, in the market. So the beginning of it is always a need of the customer that we could see in the market, or a competitive advantage that we want to discover, or that we want to test a bit more. And that's the starting point of, how do we really prioritize what's the goal and what's the customer need. And coming from that, we can have, for example, strategic initiatives. We can have 10 strategic initiatives that are created by the board that do accommodate or do facilitate some of these needs of the market, but we can't implement all of them. It's the best way to verify which path we should take, for example, is to use the MVP method. Instead of going all in into 1 or 2 initiatives, we test 7 or 8 of them. And after a very short period of time, we'd know that 3, for example, of them have the potential to develop and satisfy the client, where 4 strategic initiatives that we thought may be interesting are not really that favorable for the market. So when it comes to the importance, I think that we always start with the customer need, and that's how the business should prioritize their importance of initiatives.
Thank you. Mitch-wise, MVP, thanks, Chris. You're correct that your goals are not the part of the MVP. Another good point to test some initiatives at strategic level will help. Yes, absolutely, yes. We can't stress this enough. We are all about testing. Agile organizations are all about testing, and testing with customers. Yes. soon and
Yeah.
as often as possible. Do we have any more questions? Because we're conscious of time. We're about 53 minutes into the session. I still have a few minutes left. Okay, so we'll not push it, we'll not force it. I think it's time for us to move on. And before we end this session, once again, we would like to remind you about the feedback. The feedback form link is posted in the chat window. Please be so kind and leave feedback for us so we can adapt, we can inspect, adapt, and improve. And thank you very much for joining today's session. And please reach out to us. We're available. We will answer any question we get. Thank you. Have a great day. Thank you for joining us. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.